very familiar with Larry and his company's work. And I'm very happy to be here because this is a very interesting case and a very interesting report that we have, which I've had an opportunity to review before today's meeting. So I just want to go over our agenda. I'm going to be introducing team members from Safestart Environmental. Obviously, Larry Schwartz is here. Larry is the president and CEO of Safestart Environmental. I've known Larry for years, and Larry is really one of the preeminent indoor environmental engineers in the country. He has done over 10,000 mold remediation tests and remediation reports. He's a published author. He has just recently published an authoritative publication involving building science and human health. And again, Larry is literally one of the most highly regarded, if not the most highly regarded, indoor environmental engineers in the country. So we're very happy that he was able to put together this report and that we have him here today. We also have from Safestart Environmental, Michelle Fisher. She is the Director of Operations with Safestart. And we have some field operation testing persons. We have Darren Eckes, Mark Ripley, and Raphael Bibian. We're also joined today by three physicians, Dr. Andrew Heyman, Dr. Scott McMahon, and Dr. Eric Doringer. So I'm not going to get too deep in the weeds in their backgrounds. I can tell you that I've had the opportunity to work with Dr. Scott McMahon. Dr. Scott McMahon is probably the #1 expert in the world on a condition called CIRS, or chronic inflammatory response syndrome, which is unfortunately a condition that individuals can be exposed to, and because of mold and mold-related toxins. And it's a very debilitating condition, and it really has severe consequences on people's lives. And we have several cases that we're dealing with where Dr. McMahon is treating some of our patients. So we're very familiar with CIRS and that condition and how debilitating CIRS can be, and how people contract CIRS from being put into close contact with mold and other biotoxins. And again, Dr. Andrew Heyman is here, Dr. Eric Doringer, and in our agenda, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be having an introduction by Larry Schwartz as to what mold is and the dangers behind mold, and then to get into and kind of dig into the weeds of this indoor environmental report that Larry and his team put together for the Adams County Courthouse. And maybe we're then going to hear from physicians also who are going to talk about the health effects of being exposed to mold. And then one thing that's very important that I really suggest that if you have questions you participate in, we're going to have a question and answer session. And how that works is at the bottom of your screen, there's a chat feature. And we'd like you, if you have a question, to type in your question. And we want to give particular importance to employees of the courthouse. So if you're an employee of the courthouse and you have a question, what I'd ask that you do is that you put employee or an E before your question so that we prioritize those questions. And we want to focus first on questions that employees may have regarding the medical aspects of being exposed to mold. And then we're going to go to the physicians to answer those questions. And then any other remaining questions, to the extent we have time left today, Larry or a member of his team is going to answer for you. So we are then going to wrap it up and do a little conclusion. But we wanted to thank you. I don't know how many people we have on the Zoom. At last count, I think it was 80 or so, and probably climbing. So it's a very interesting topic. It's probably very personal to all of you. It's extremely personal to those of you who work in the building. And so for that, we thank you, and thank you for taking time out of your evening today to sit here with us. And I just want to turn it over to Larry Schwartz. He's going to maybe fill you in a little bit more on his background and then give you an understanding of mold and mold-related toxins.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. So glad you could be here to help us. Before we even talk about this slide that's up, I want to indicate a couple other things with our esteemed physicians here. Dr. Heyman does not only nationally, but a lot of international work. He's highly regarded. He's currently medical director of the Integrative Medicine Department at the George Washington University School of Medicine as well. Dr. Dorninger deals also with many of these patients and treating them, and he particularly knows a lot in your area. In the past few years, I've worked with him in treating properties for patients of his that live in the Quincy area, as well as, at least, one of the people that visits the courthouse. So he's very familiar with things a lot in your area. On the screen that's up right now, and by the way, the really good news is I'm going to be teaching you a bunch of stuff. I'll make it fast before we get into the heavy stuff in the questions and answers. But the good news is there's going to be no pop-up exams, no midterms, and no final exams. So rather than try and memorize whatever I'm telling you, I just want you to get the gist of it, because that's the important thing. And I want to do it because in order to understand things in the report we're going to talk about, you have to understand these concepts. So the first thing I want to talk about is most people don't realize it, but myself, my firm, and what we've tried to impart with our colleagues, there's a real distinction between what we call traditional and inflammatory investigations and health effects with water on building materials. So I'm going to not read you everything in these boxes, but give you the gist. But know this, well over 95% of all the mold inspectors and testers in the country, the same ratio on all the mold remediators, probably the same ratio on the physicians, and pretty much the same ratio in the insurance industry, operate in what we call traditional paradigm. So in this first box on the left, 5 to 10% of the population suffer from allergy and irritation to water damage and mold. On the next box down, typical symptoms are more upper respiratory, headache, runny nose, itchy eyes, asthma, etc. And under that, the usual methods of environmental testing, highly used spore trap air test, tape lifts, bulk materials. The lab work produces the family name or genus of the molds. They don't get into the spore identification and concentrations. And why that's important, you need to get to the species in the inflammatory, because each species creates specific chemicals during mold growth that will explain what the purpose of that is in a moment. So now look over to the right side. The doctors will help you understand when you talk to them tonight that we know at least 24% of the population, because these people are born with certain groups of genes, make them vulnerable to inflammatory illness, such as what's called CIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome, and other things such as mast cell activation and other inflammatory environmental illness. There's up to 30 plus typical symptoms that are different from the symptoms of traditional. And some of the more common of those, as the doctors will tell you, are things like brain fog, extreme fatigue, joint pain, et cetera, et cetera. Doesn't mean if you have those, you're suffering from this, because it would really require a medical diagnosis. Now, in the inflammatory, the usual methods of testing may include traditional methods, but also need to perform qPCR. You all kind of know that from COVID PCR testing, polymerase chain reaction. In other words, these tests tell us at the species level what's on surfaces that's important. Going down a little bit, let me just back up and look at the side on the left, these notes and highlighted in yellow. Individuals that are vulnerable may fall into one or both of these paradigms, or they may fall into one or the other. If they're really lucky, they don't fall into either one. Now, here's the real takeaway. If the environment is treated only for traditional, it will not be effective for inflammatory individuals. If the environment is treated for the inflammatory, it will cover traditional and inflammatory. Know this, in this country right now, most mold remediation does not cover inflammatory. And why is that important? Think of this, if 24% of the population, and we have reason to believe it's higher, have this vulnerability. So say a family is in a home or a workplace, or the workers, and there's 4 or more people working there. The odds are one or more of those people is vulnerable to the inflammatory effects. Therefore, all these remediations should be done to meet inflammatory conditions. Next slide, please. Can we get the next slide, please? Go back one. Thank you. Okay. Traditional treatments address events at a specific point in time as these events occur. And the inflammatory, let me give you a little background. Part of this is what's on the next slide, part of what I call Mold 101. We'll get through this quickly because we want to have time for a lot of questions. So what happens when mold grows? Mold eats what it grows on. It has little roots from its cells to go into the food source, whether it's a piece of bread or a banana or a berry or a drywall. And it needs moisture or water to help dissolve the food source to go up into the cell to give it energy to grow. And what happens when it grows? We call it metabolism. And when that occurs, this family name of mold, for example, Aspergillus, will morph into over 100 different variations of itself we call species that have 2 names. Because it has 2 names, in my own head, I kind of call them the children and the Aspergillus family, the parent. And why do we need to go there? Because at the species level, these species create chemicals that are specific chemicals to each species. And these chemicals are there to fight warfare with their neighbors for taking over, killing, and dominating the area. And while that goes on, not only spores, but mold parts that are more like 50 times more plentiful in the air than the spores themselves go in the air with these chemicals on them. And they attach to walls, content, structure, books, furniture, and dry. You don't see them. They're very small. And they can hang around for years and years if they're not cleaned properly. And what happens when there are air currents and disturbances in the presence of these plated out mold parts and dust, they go into the air one breathes. And that really is the major trigger to trigger symptoms of the inflammatory patient. And that's really important. I'll explain why in a little bit and describing how building needs to be treated to be solved of the problems. And on the lower left, there's a thing called post-testing, post-remediation verification outlined in a document the insurance industry created on how to do proper mold remediation. And I want to point out also the EPA years ago put out a publication called Mold Remediation in Commercial Buildings and Schools. And they describe things like putting up containments to contain work areas, how to treat air in the work area during work, so things in there don't spread into the rest of the building. These things need to be adhered to. Post-testing is a little different in both categories, but myself and Dr. Heyman right now, who's on with us, are conducting a study right now on a newer device that can measure what's in the air one breathes over a 5-day period of time or less. And we're correlating medical health effects with these results to get some really useful, good info. There's some really good things on our horizon, very, very close, that will help in post-testing to say a property that's being cleaned properly, is safe. Okay, I also want to say, I want to begin also by thanking the Adams County Courthouse for responding to employee concerns of their work environment and allowing us to perform. Our goal tonight is to shed light with all of our findings it is important to have an understanding of what's actually going on in the building as it relates to health. I want to explain these categories, which we just kind of went through. In practice, most people are familiar with the traditional paradigm. We've talked about that. And the survey, let me explain this. Before, we didn't have a long notice of this opportunity to do this work at the courthouse. We were brought in at the last minute, maybe a day or two, no, maybe it was a little longer than that, of an opportunity to give a proposal to do this job. And before we could even create a proposal, I figured I need to know more about what's going on in this building. This is an 80,000 square foot building with 4 occupied levels and 1 occupied level. I mean, it is just huge. There are many HVAC systems. So I created a simple questionnaire with 5 or 6 questions. We were able to get it distributed to many of the employees of the building. We got about 113 responses back. And we didn't ask for exact workplaces people were in, but places they either work in or visit. And we asked about different type of symptoms to circle to give us an idea what areas seem to have the highest amount of health effects and break them apart between traditional, inflammatory, or combination. I have with me here, I'm not going to bring them out, you know, all these questionnaires we got back. Some of them have several pages of handwritten notes of people that are having more serious issues. But of those 113, and that's not the whole population of the building, 70% of them seem to have some serious health effects that they indicated were more prevalent in the building than anywhere else they go to. And of those, 40% of them displayed more inflammatory type symptoms than the traditional or a combination of both. I mean, based on how this goes in commercial buildings, I mean, a 70% ratio is extremely high. It often goes by the term a sick building or a toxic building. But tonight, we're definitely going to answer, when I was asked in previous meetings, what should we do with this building? You know, there's so much more involved in that opinion and decision. I'm hopeful tonight, beside my opinions, we're going to get the opinion of these medical professionals to get joint opinion as to an answer to that question. And we are going to get it answered tonight. And in addition, I'm going to offer some directions one should look at for solutions of how to solve this problem. It's not that I have all the right answers, but I have a lot of experience that can offer some guidance that should be helpful. I would hope it would be helpful. So on that section, I think we're ready. Let me just check something here a minute to go to the next slide. Great. So we'll kind of whiz through here. We're not ready for the midterm exam yet, but mycotoxins. So mycotoxins, these chemicals I mentioned that are created during the growth of mold and metabolism, when they go airborne, the Latin word mycotoxins means airborne toxin. That means these toxins are in the air one can breathe. We've kind of talked already about where they come from the metabolism of growing mold. And where they're found in a building is wherever they attach or played out. But it's really important also to know whether these molds or mycotoxins are dead or alive, or the spores, makes no difference. It's like the old Western poster, wanted dead or alive. Dead or alive, these things can bring on the symptoms in a patient. Now, remedial steps required to make the space safe. So there's environmentally safe methods of remediation that are different from traditional. So here's a picture of the building. It's huge. We spent one day, I'm kind of backing up a little. Go back. Yeah, no, go to the picture of the building, please. Stay there, please. Okay. Before we came to the building, this survey was really critical because we could prepare. We had a day, I spent a day with the team, the 3 gentlemen here on the Zoom we'll talk about, and one who's on the team who had some surgeries today and couldn't be here. But we met and we decided what test we need to do where. And we prepared all the sampling packets, the chain of custodies, all the information, the locations they were going to go to, because we didn't want to get down there and spend productive time scratching our heads. What are we going to do here? Are we just going to walk through the building with spore trap air testers, which is typically done? That wouldn't answer our questions. So I was there a full day with the team. The team was there 3.5 days total. We worked in a group going from one work area in the building to another. We were taken by an escort, and each team member had specific tasks to do in each work area. Some took dust samples off air vents. Some took dust samples off walls and content. Some did spore trap air testing. Some did photos and wrote visual notes. Some used an infrared imaging system to look for active water moisture or moisture meters. We performed over 100 tests. We spent over a week-long analysis of labs and data. We learned, which we didn't know initially in our proposal, we weren't given all the info we had asked for. We were given some old 8.5 by 11 floor plans that weren't even current, didn't even indicate all the HVAC systems, but there are 12 different systems on different levels supplying air to mixed and current levels in the building. This, from a building science perspective, this is not what we expected to see. There are some unique complications in this building, and one is part with the HVAC systems, part with open channels where air mixes above each other on floors with large openings, mixing air throughout different levels of the building. So there's a number of challenges we had to take into consideration. Back to that 101 slide, if you can, Carly. No, that one. Thank you. Stay there for now. Okay, so the deal is on the different methods of remediation, 95% or more of remediators in the country. The big deal is kill mold, kill mold, kill mold. Doesn't matter if the mold's live or dead. Killing it isn't the deal. And killing it, strong chemicals are used called biocides, that those chemicals have fumes and fragrances and chemicals that get in the air that can affect symptoms of the inflammatory patient. And we find to get rid of live and dead problems, it's cleaning is the deal. Soaps, surfactants, special ones that don't have fragrances that can affect you. Methods of elbow grease and cleaning, because they'll clean live and dead mold off of surfaces. They may leave stains, they're enzyme stains, but they're not mold. And we find this works really well. So there's different methods of remediation. And there's a high link of a relationship between indoor air quality and the efficacy of medical treatments. Think of it like this. Imagine that we all have an imaginary tank on our body that collects what we call cytokine inflammagens. It won't be on the test. Just think of them as contaminants. And picture at the bottom of, picture the stuff looks like a liquid sloshing around like in a gas tank. And at the bottom of that tank is a drain pipe and a valve. And your medical practitioners can give you treatments to open that valve and drain the tank. We don't want that tank full, we want it empty. Myself and my colleagues focus on the pipe and valve coming at the top of the tank where bad stuff comes in. And our goal is to tighten that valve to slow stuff coming in. So where it gets important, the takeaway is, if the bad stuff coming in is equal or greater in speed than the stuff going out, the tank will not empty. And even on meds, the patient may not get better. So the critical thing in the school of prevention is to make the environment correct. The medical treatments are, after prevention's been breached, how do we treat this? But there's got to be a balance. Just treating it isn't enough. Treatments won't work without the prevention piece in it. I have one other last part to my mold 101 you need to know. I tell a lot of my clients, I give them a simple analogy, because in correcting indoor air quality, there's three things we work with. So this analogy, it's a sound real story, real pokey, kind of like a fairy tale deal. The picture that you employees work in the back half of a large empty box shaped like a shoebox. And halfway across the box, there's 4 or 5 air purification machines like filters. And at the far end wall of the box, you never know when, but occasionally a sandstorm comes out and it travels through to the other end of the box. Sometimes the sandstorm is light, sometimes medium, sometimes heavy, sometimes very heavy. So when that sandstorm comes out light or medium, you might have enough air purifiers to take all that out of the air before the sand gets back to where you're working. Now, when that sandstorm comes heavy, some of that sand gets where you are, but maybe it's not a high enough level to trigger symptoms of a vulnerable person. When that sandstorm is very heavy, it will probably trigger symptoms. And what do you do now? You open a window on each side of your workspace, you put a fan and blow air out one and bring fresh air in the other and blow the remaining sand out. So here's the takeaways. Obviously, the wall ejecting sand represents a source of mold or mycotoxins. The sand itself represents the contaminants of the mycotoxins. The air purifiers represent themselves, and blowing the air out represents ventilation. So here's takeaways. You're never going to work or live in a place with no sand. My goal is to help keep that level of sand below trigger levels of patients as best we can, and to keep that level of sand from spiking from time to time. And we also want to remove parts of that wall that are causing the sand to emit. So our solutions involve finding these walls that emit sand and negating them from the equation. And we want to figure out, will air purification be sufficient? Do we need to get into power ventilation? And, you'll never live in a clean room. You'll never have a place without sand, but it has to be controlled properly. It's important to kind of understand the relation in health issues, how this all works with environment. So I'm ready to move on, that we can talk about the testing we did. We decided to display 2 findings from 2 work areas in the courthouse. I want to explain what these all mean and how it's laid out. So, for example, in courtroom 1A, we displayed these findings. We looked at each lab we performed, which we're going to show you the actual lab shortly, and how we decided on each type of lab whether we felt it was unacceptable for health, acceptable, or maybe kind of on a tipping point. And we also correlated how many individuals that work in or visit that area that on these questionnaires indicated they had health effects in that area. On the far left, we have a meter that measures, like outdoors, the general particle density of particles of certain size, typical of mold spores, was 6,240, or the outdoor is 4,230, and it was elevated about a third higher indoors, which kind of says a combination of filtration and ventilation isn't working real well. Okay, now in the fungi 10, that's a dust test that does qPCR testing for the inflammatory paradigm. And we found in there extreme elevation of Stachybotrys, a type of mold species that requires 95% water or moisture activity on a food source to grow over a period of time. Stachy is the mold the press many years ago called the black mold. It creates a mycotoxin more virulent than many of the others that can cause health effects. But we also did a fungi 10 on the supply air vent, where air comes into the room, and we did a spore trap air sample. Now the air sample measures how many spores per cubic meter of air over a 5-minute period of time. It doesn't give numbers that are homogeneously the same over a time period. Whatever's going on that can disturb a mold reservoir, or even walking in a room, that air movement can create higher levels of spore density in the air. But what showed up in there was an extreme elevation of a group of molds called Aspergillus penicillium. We call them water damage molds. They're most common. They have species that can affect both traditional and inflammatory. And on the visuals, for example, we noted 2 supply vents were dirty. The west supply vent looks more moldy visually. The judge's chamber has green carpet tile. There was a strong fragrance in the chamber, unable to find the source. No thermal anomalies at the time, meaning the infrared didn't show any active moisture in surfaces it looked at. Next slide, please. So here's an example of the west supply vent in that ceiling of that room that had apparent current or past water damage. And if you look carefully, you'll see some mold spots in the grills. Courtroom itself, it's a smaller courtroom. It has no windows in it, which kind of means, even the spore trap air test we took is a little more valid. Next slide, please. These are copies of the actual lab reports we got regarding these areas. And on the far right, on the upper, you'll see courtroom 1A. And there's the names of 5 species on the left. These are in a group that comprises what we call a Hertzme tube test. Almost laughable, it's called Hertzme, but it's a medical acronym. If you want to know what it is, our esteemed physicians can answer that for you tonight. But here's the deal. On these 5 species, the top one, Aspergillus pinosiotes, took me a week to say it well, almost laughable. But that requires only 59% water activity or moisture on a food source to grow. Now, on the far right, in spore equivalents per milligram of dust, they were elevated at 297. The versicolor requires 85%. The chetomium requires 90%. Stachybotrys requires 95%. Look at that, it was 92. I would say 98% of the time, we see that level in a workplace or a home, less than 2%. Many buildings and commercial buildings have 0 tolerance for Stachybotrys at all. It creates some of the most virulent mycotoxin chemicals. This is so high, it gets 6 gigs on the Hertzme score. And the Wallemia was a little bit lower. It requires about 60% water. Now you see a red score at the bottom, 16, I believe. Now, a group of physicians, and one in particular, did a study several years ago of over 800 patients with inflammatory illness, where they correlated, these patients were treated and re-entered their homes, and they correlated relapse rates of individuals reacting to mycotoxins from mold with this Hertzme score. And here's the result. If that score were 0 through 10, the average relapse rate was under 2%. If that score was 10 to 15, the average relapse rate was 47%. Over 15, it was over 90%, and asymptotically approached close to 100% as you reach a score near 50, which is the maximum Hertzme score. So that, and then we'll just talk about this courtroom right now. Then we did what we call a fungi 10. I want you to know what this is. This gives the 5 Hertzme scores, but 5 other species that create chemical mycotoxins that affect these patients. For example, the top 4 on the left column, Aspergillus flavus, Fumigatus, nigerocratius. The name of the chemical they create is just to the right of that. And every one of these, if the patient takes a medical test to measure mycotoxins, for example, in urine, we almost always see ochratoxin A. We almost always see mycophenolic acid if you go down that list to Penicillium brevicompactum. So these are important species beside the Hertzme species. In the columns that say full, where some of these numbers are in red, for example, in the courtroom 1A, take, for example, the Stachybotrys at 92. It says the fold is 46. So the gentleman that created a test called ERMI, Environmental Residential Moldiness Index, about 20 some years ago, was given the task of measuring moldiness in houses. He worked for the EPA, he's still there. And he averaged these concentrations of these species of over 400 homes around the country. And this is saying that that score of 92 was 46 times higher than the national average at that time. So it gives us an idea of how important these numbers are. We use these labs to come up with the opinions we put in a couple slides up where we show you an overall picture of what's going on in that work area. We didn't just pull these out of our head. We had to analyze every single one of these labs to answer every one of those 100 labs on the report. Now, the last in this area were the spore trap air test. So the center column is courtroom 1A. And you see two types of mold. These are not species, but a group of Aspergillus penicillium at a concentration of, I'm trying to read it, I think it's 3,700. And the cladosporium 9130, total at the bottom, 12,810 or 18. We typically don't want to see totals more than 2,000. Can maybe range up to 5,000 with some degree of safety. This is well over what we're shooting for. Additionally, the Aspergillus penicillium at that level tells us there's been a high level of moisture or water in that area over, that's caused this to be. And if you look at courtroom 1B to the right, it had no Aspergillus penicillium, and it was basically next door with a little hallway in between. So, in comparing that way, we're allowed to do this comparison. Is sanctioned by the majority of members of the American Congress of Governmental Industrial Hygiene and the Indoor Air Quality Association of America. But especially in commercial buildings where an outdoor sample has really no close relevance to the work area or area you're testing, we can test neighboring areas and different HVAC systems. So we feel pretty confident in courtroom 1A. These numbers we see were caused by things that went on in that room. Okay, we can go to the next slide. I'm going to take a drink of water here for a second. The other area we wanted to illustrate was in the sub-basement. And you think, well, nobody works there. Why are we doing that? And the reason is there's a thing called stack effect. Air rises from lower levels up. So what goes on here also gets mixed in air at upper levels. And the way this building is configured, we know that's going on kind of big time. So when we look at this, there was, a pretty good amplification of particle densities in this room compared to outdoors. Again, a function of filtration and ventilation. In the fungi 10 surfaces we're going to look at shortly, there were very highly elevated levels of ketomum and stachy that create some of the most virulent chemicals that cause inflammatory symptoms. The dust on the supply vent was acceptable. The air sample was acceptable, but think of this. At the time we did this, machines were off, no people were moving around. There was no air perhaps coming through the vent system to disturb things on surfaces that could get into the air. So even though it's acceptable now, it could easily change. On the swab tape lift, it was unacceptable, and we'll show you a sample of that and what we mean. And on the visuals, you can kind of see, and even in the right-hand picture, on the very lower left, you'll see mold growth on some of the boxes and papers and all, besides what's on the wall. And it's important to know that even movement around there or moving these materials, if the area is not contained, can put more bad stuff in the air that can travel through the building. Following even the EPA guidelines, any work done or movement in any of these areas need to be properly contained with engineering controls on the air. Next page, please. These were the labs in that area. So you see a lot here. We'll go through these kind of quickly. On the upper left, these were microscopically read swabs that were from swabs that were taken, for example, boiler room, the record wall, the bottom one. It had a medium level of alternaria, rare cladosporium, and a high level of what's called penicillium thalliomyces, which You can check in Google. We kind of looked it up and may create some skin conditions or other things of that nature. The upper one had anywhere from low to rare to medium levels of some important molds that could maybe cause more of the traditional health effects. On the lower left, on the fungi 10, the Aspergillus niger was illustrated that creates this ochratoxin chemical. The Breva compactum was a little elevated, and well, up now we're going to stay with the subbasement on the right where it's boxed in red. The Niger was 78, 19-fold on that creates bad stuff. The Stachybotrys was 42 with a fold of 21. Again, very toxic kind of mold, creating very virulent mycotoxin. On the upper right, which was the spore trap air test, they came out acceptable, but again, it was for that 5-minute point in time, not that for all time. On the lower right, the actual calculation of the Hertzme score on the right-hand side was a 14, which is 1 point away from a 15, which has a 90% relapse rate. Again, these are how we analyze each one of these of 100 labs to come up with opinions on the last slide we showed you to kind of give an overall opinion of that area. Next slide, please. This was, on the first page of our 20-some page report. And in summary, we indicated that the overall opinions of acceptable indoor air quality for health purposes were unacceptable. And it's important to go through some of these paragraphs. There was a presence of hydrophilic mold that requires high moisture levels on food sources to grow, such as Stachybotrys, Aspergillus. These are all considered more virulent on health effects. Next paragraph. The testing results were sent to labs certified to provide info on both current and historic water damage and moisture in the building. See the attached reports. Observations inside air handlers, the furnaces, air conditioners, and supply vents that we could see, which were accessible during the investigation, that some have interior insulation. In almost every case where there's interior insulation on ductwork, it is compromised on the urea formaldehyde binder on the insulation as a food source for microbial growth. And as air flows over it, it gets into the airstream. The interior insulation is in the ductwork where there's high humidity and virtually always contaminated. Additionally, the visible condition of the ductwork and junctions of ductwork indicate a lack of cleaning and maintenance. Consider the ductwork system as a transportation system, moving air from one location to another. Specifically, the location of some of these handlers are not on the same level of the building where the air is being transported to. So, I mean, even if you want to close off a floor at a time to do things, it gets kind of defeated. You know this in duct cleaning, there's duct cleaning and duct cleaning. And there's a National Association of Duct Cleaner protocol that's very important to follow so that you're not blowing bad stuff back into other areas, and that the air blown through during that cleaning doesn't go through filters back into the building, but goes outdoors. And we don't like any chemical sprays or sanitizers because they're kill chemicals we don't need that can get in the air and cause inflammatory symptoms. We recommend a review of all photos, labs, and notes to fully understand the assessment provided. Next slide, please. So before we go to Q&A, I would like to have each of the physicians on this panel, kind of address what I've gone through, and also perhaps address some guides for those of you that visit or work in the building, of some tips of the type of healthcare to find, if there's any kind of protections they can recommend, they can be very helpful. And I think after they speak, let's do some Q&A with them, and then we'll do some Q&A on everything I've presented. And at the end, I have some thoughts on potential ways to look at what kind of potential solutions there could be for this situation. So let me start with Dr. Heyman, if you'd like to chime in. Is he unmuted? Dr. Heyman, do you hear me?
Okay.
There we go.
Thanks, Larry. Thanks everyone for being here. My, clinical research and medical practice is primarily focused on this subject of mold exposure in water damaged buildings. And I know there are probably a lot of questions around, am I affected? And if so, in what way? One thing I would articulate is that sort of in traditional medical model, we tend to account mostly for mold reactions in terms of an allergic response. And the work that our group has done, which includes Dr. McMahon and Dorninger, have identified a different kind of bodily response that we kind of generally call inflammation. And we all know what inflammation is when you cut your hand and the area becomes red and swollen and painful. But when individuals are exposed to mold, there's a possibility that all of their tissues and organs become inflamed. And this ends up being more of a systemic illness in that regard, and one that can generally affect severely the person's quality of life. Typical symptoms: fatigue, brain fog, headaches, memory loss, depression and anxiety, pain syndromes, digestive complaints. Weight gain is common. You might be surprised at the degree to which the body can be affected in a variety of ways that we don't necessarily account for. But that's really just a failure of how do we look for it and evaluate. And we know that there's a certain proportion of the population that is particularly vulnerable to this inflammatory response. If you are vulnerable, it's usually genetically mediated. And that means the person's body becomes more inflamed relatively easily. But in some cases, and much more insidious, even if one removes oneself from the water damaged building, the inflammatory response can perpetuate itself and remain somewhat chronic, even though the exposure has been dealt with. So in the case of this building, I think it's important, first of all, for people to ask themselves, do I have allergic symptoms when I enter the building, but do I have some of these other symptoms as well that I might not have accounted for? And you might even find that when you leave the building, your symptoms can still persist. It requires a relatively involved evaluation, one that's somewhat specialized. There's some simple things that you can do to identify if this is going on. But at the end of the day, it really does require a medical professional to unwind whether or not this process is occurring and then to deal with it appropriately. There's a couple of randomized controlled trials that have been shown to help resolve this process, but it's a stepwise protocol and one that's relatively involved.
Great. I'd like to call on Scott McMahon, Dr. McMahon, for some of your input on this.
Well, first of all, thank you, Ari, for inviting me to be a part of this town hall. I'm a physician that's been studying and seeing patients with this illness now for 13 years. I've seen about 2,000 people. And I will say that, as has been previously said, Larry is one of the best people in the country to evaluate a building as to whether it might make people ill. I have, there are 6 people in the entire United States that I recommend when my patients need to have their homes or their businesses evaluated. And Larry is one of those 6. There are only 6 that I recommend. And that's because of his knowledge and experience. In reading through the overview of the testing of this building, and noticed that there were 48 different areas where testing was done. And 41 of those 48 had an error, at least one objective test that showed that that area was unacceptable. So that's almost 85% of the building. And then on top of that, you have your HVAC systems that are spreading mold spores around. So I think that there's a distinct problem with the building that will require a considerable amount of work, and Larry can talk more about that. As Dr. Heyman was saying, this illness that you can get called chronic inflammatory response syndrome, CIRS, is it's a real thing. I saw one of the questions was asking if it's gone through the rigors of peer review, and the answer is that from my research group alone that I work with, there are 32 published peer-reviewed articles in the medical literature that have defined what the symptoms of this illness are, what the physical exam findings are, what the abnormal lab tests are, what the imaging results are, what the abnormalities of transcriptomics, which is at the cell level, what your body, the chemicals your body is actually making, and as well as defining treatment protocols and whatnot. We define prevalence. This is a real illness. The problem is many physicians are not aware of this because some of the journals that we published in are not ones that they happen to read. But it is a real thing. And then the last thing I would mention is that if you're wondering if maybe you have this illness or a mold-based illness as a result of your exposure, you can have just simple respiratory problems. Like Larry had mentioned earlier, 5 to 10% of the people will have allergies. It can cause asthma. It can trigger asthma. But there are other illnesses that you can have. So if you're having respiratory problems in the building, if you, and particularly if you're having multi-system illness, and that's a confusing term, but if it's affecting multiple different areas of your body, so you're having fatigue and headaches and stomach issues and eye issues and other issues, you're urinating 10 to 15 times a day, if you're having all sorts of different problems, it could be a number of different diseases, or it could all be the one chronic inflammatory response syndrome. So, we can't really give you individualized medical advice during this town hall, but you should seek, if you're having those kind of problems, you should seek your regular physician. And if you're having multiple problems in multiple areas of your body, you should seek people that are knowledgeable about chronic inflammatory response syndrome. So thank you.
Great. Eric Dorninger, like to hear, your comments and spin on this and on the validity of the report. Can we hear you? Speak up.
Can you guys hear me?
Now, yes.
Okay. So the first thing I want to comment on is I think it takes a lot of courage on Larry's part to have a town hall like this. Larry's kind of a mom and pop guy that's not looking for making big waves in the house, but he has an integral backbone. And like Dr. Heyman and like Dr. McMahon, I would 100% agree. He's top 6 in the nation. And when Larry is close enough to one of our patients, we take a big sigh of relief because we know the job's going to get done right. And I jokingly say to my patients, Larry Schwartz is like Santa Claus and Einstein had a baby. He has a very calm, wonderful demeanor, but he's one of the smartest guys in the room and understands building health and its correlation to human health. And we don't have enough people in his industry that are willing to work with doctors and doctors who are willing to work with building professionals. And I've learned so much from Larry on how airflow works and how moisture builds up. Al Gore stole the title of this courthouse. This is an inconvenient truth. This is an inconvenient truth. No one wants this to be the story of the Quincy courthouse. And we all got to deal with it. or people are going to continue to be sick. And I'm over 1,000 biotoxin patients in, and I've looked at thousands of buildings, and this is on the upper echelon of contamination. This is on the upper echelon of concerning buildings. And I want to be clear, it's not about perfection. No building will be sterile. And people think of this as a disease of toxicity, and there is some truth in that. But this is even more a disease of immunoreactivity. And per what Dr. Heyman was saying, you can have two people in this exact same courthouse. One is doing okay because they have genes that can recognize these toxins and clear them from the body. The other group of people don't have the right immune response genetics, and they will turn on an alternate immune system called the innate immune responses, and they just cytokine storm. And that's just like getting out an M60 and praying and spraying at the mycotoxin, not being able to recognize an antigen, present it, and remove it. And that's why, per Dr. Heyman's comments and per Dr. McMahon's comments, you get multi-system, multi-symptom illness. For me, who was a treated SIRS patient, 10 years ago, I came down with this illness. My biggest experience was brain fog and depression with occasional suicidal ideations. I didn't have asthma. I thought I should jump off a building. I couldn't find my keys, and I felt flat and thought this was just how life would be. I have such a robust, beautiful, joyous brain and life now because I was made aware of the science of this illness and went through the treatment protocol, got my butt into clean buildings. And it's about getting these buildings to a place that doesn't trigger immune reactivity in the patient. It's not about getting you to a clean room. It's about getting to levels that are statistically likely to no longer trigger immune responses. Larry did a very smart thing on this building that the industry often whitewashed. He used qPCR. qPCR is quantitative polymerase chain reaction. That's an amplification technique. As he said, like with a virus, you need PCR to amplify things you can't see. And in the chat, we have people talking about looking for fuzzy sweaters. They want to see big, giant, three-dimensional microbial growth on a building that's getting our patients sick. And about 90% of the time, we don't see that. Those boxes that we are seeing in the basement, we don't see that on buildings. We literally have 0.1 microns invisible to the human naked eye getting picked up by a Swiffer cloth that can then get amplified to show you, oh my gosh, there must be moisture in the building. And I want to speak to Stachybotrys. That should not be growing inside indoor buildings. There are molds in the Mojave Desert. There are molds everywhere. You have molds in the desert. You need two things for them to amplify, grow, and create health and human illness. You need food, and that's the good-looking piece of junk American buildings made of paper and pulp. And then you need water. And if you have the junky paperback sheetrock and wood pulp and carpet padding, you still don't get into trouble until moisture accumulates. And that can be from a supply line leak to the refrigerator, or it can be a damp basement that floods. It can be trapped humidity. It can be an HVAC that doesn't turn over air well, and so on and so forth. So these levels are going to drive illness, and we are not out to get Quincy. We are out to get Quincy's population healthy again. And this is not about blame or shame. It's about taking an accountability of integrity to say, is this level of microbial growth getting people ill in Quincy? And the scary thing is, if a government blows this off now, Medicare picks up the bill later. And one of the phenomenon of this is cognitive decline. And I will tell you, in our area, a Cadillac facility for memory care is $25K a month. That's $300,000 a year. You blow through your family finances, and then you're in a Medicare facility at $6 to $12K a year. So it's pay now and get things done right and get your community healthy, or pay a lot more later. So I really want to make myself available for anyone who really wants to honestly and earnestly work through this building and this crisis, and really appreciate how intense this must be for everybody. This is not about blame and shame. This is about getting this building safe so that the people who work there and the people who are in prison or doing a little time can actually have a chance at redemption with a functional brain. So that's my concerns.
Great, thank you. I'll give you, in my conclusions, I'm going to point in ways I recommend to look at potential solutions and some of the thoughts in that. But I want to tell you, based on the medical opinions, my professional environmental opinions, I consider this building not safe. I would highly recommend people avoid being in the building. And I think that what should be considered right now with post haste, all these functions that go on in this building are extremely important. They must continue. And there needs to be some search for ways to safely find places and safely move and treat content to other locations to perform these functions until this building can be made safe. Now, you don't have to do what I'm suggesting. These are my professional opinions. You can do what you want to do. But if you think just remediation is an answer, think about this. To correct the building environmentally, you think of remediation as solving the problem by just wiping clean and getting rid of the visual mold. Those things are sources that create the stuff that goes in the air and attaches to surfaces of building and content. So just getting rid of the sources is key, but it doesn't get rid of the remainder of bad stuff it created in the building. So another step has to be made after cleaning and getting it done in a safe way with proper containments and engineering controls to go through a very high labor situation of following the right protocols, methods, and materials to safely clean these surfaces. And I must tell you, in most remediation jobs, they perform without a lot of oversight supervision on site. And when that is not there, especially in a building like this, even though the workers are doing their job, they're more likely to miss areas. I mean, this is a huge scope. I mean, a lot of areas, it's not like every square inch is going to get cleaned properly. You can count on that. And you can count on the proposal being about 25% less than it's really going to be, because during this work, they're going to find other areas that weren't visible till remediation takes place that'll increase the scope of the job and the cost of the job. Additionally, there's building science problems with the condition of ductwork and the air handlers, inside the handlers themselves. If they're serviceable, the blades of the fans need special cleaning. The air conditioning coils may need replacement or special cleaning. The insulated ductwork needs to be replaced. Condition of junctions of ductwork need to be sealed to keep them from sucking in surrounding air. Areas where there's openings in floors where air mixes between floors need to be contained with construction. So there's probably at least 3 to 5 or 6 different kind of contractors involved to fix the building. And my suggestion is, and it's going to cost some money to do it, to get proposals for all the work that needs to be done, look at those totals, and at that point, be able to make good informed decisions. And looking at the risk, if we do all this, what's the risk it's going to come out good? You know, do we do this or do we look at other options? Would that same money be better spent building another facility or taking down and rebuilding, or perhaps other kind of options? So, I mean, just the thought of hiring a remediator, and by the way, there's remediators and remediators. In commercial, there's 2-3 large companies that specialize in commercial building remediation, but they don't know diddly from inflammatory, and they need some help or protocols of how to clean and how to make solutions and all of that. So there's a lot of ways you guys need to think about this. And I would be very careful about just jumping in and saying you're going to do this or that. You really need to look at what all the real costs are going to be and what are the potential outcomes. But I think the real hard facts are right now, knowing what I know, you know, and I can't say I'm absolutely right, but my strong professional opinions are work should cease in the building. And during the temporary period, maybe people that need to be there should wear proper personal protection, N95s or P100s. When they go home, they should launder their clothing and take a shower. You know, all of those things need to be, anyone coming in the building should wear some PPE protection at this point. That's my opinion. I'm ready that we could go into Q&A for both the physicians and myself. Now, Michelle on our team, who's our chief operating officer and really makes things tick, is on board here, and she's been reading the questions. We want to try initially focus on those from people that work or visit the building. So she's going to ask the questions out loud, and and I'll direct, or she'll direct who they should go to that can try and answer them. And we'll try and wind up at a reasonable time. Hopefully, I mean, we could go all night. We're not going to do that. I'd like to wind up at the latest, maybe by 8 p.m. Central. So I'm ready to go, Michelle.
Okay, I think you've pretty much answered this first question that's resurfaced in different ways. The question's been asked, but in a nutshell, people are wondering, should the courthouse remain open? I think you've answered that. I don't know if you want to expound on any of that, or if any physicians want to expound on that, but one of the questions that has resurfaced is should this courthouse remain open?
I would like to know if the physicians, in their opinion, from what they've observed, they don't have all this data, but just their gut opinion on this.
I'll be happy to answer. Based on the evaluation of your report, Larry, and based on the understanding that something like 110 employees were surveyed and over 70 of them are having symptoms, I would say that this building is not safe.
Okay, thank you. Any other medical opinions on that?
I would just add that this is a crazy complex situation to manage. And I have a lot of compassion for that. And it's going to take a lot of fancy footwork and a lot of teamwork and a lot of integrity and a lot of coming together rather than division to pull this off. You have to find an alternative to this building, but what that looks like is going to be very complicated. I know Dr. Heyman sometimes works with delivery of tiny homes and all kinds of really clever ways to work through how to keep a school or a house or a building operating. But am I going to take a job at this building with my history of this illness? Heck no.
By the way, thank you, Eric. I need to jump in right now, Michelle, to answer something I understand that's come up. That something in chat says this report is a draft report only. I'd like to address that. The report we presented to the committee that hired us was our report. We never labeled it or called it in any way an interim or a draft or preliminary report. And discussion we had with that group, they were trying to fire away to find inconsistencies that I don't believe are real inconsistencies. They're not perfect, but the evidence here is totally overwhelming. And the report stands. The report is the report. There is no draft. If you heard that, you were misled. It's not a truth. Michelle, continue.
Okay. All right. So going back to some of these employee questions that I want to go back to kind of those that are one person says, this is an employee, I have asthma, fibromyalgia, arthritis, and a poor immune system. I feel completely different at work than I have when off for a few days, to the point of extreme asthmatic symptoms, pain, and weakness. What would you recommend?
I think that should be a physician question.
Medical, yeah.
I think that you should see your regular primary care physician about your asthma. We know that mold can cause asthma in an occupational setting. We know that chronic exposure to mold can also trigger an asthma attack. But with a multi-system presentation, you should probably also find a physician who is knowledgeable about chronic inflammatory response syndrome and be evaluated for that.
Okay.
Okay.
So two questions that kind of go together. This is a significant other of an employee who works there. What can someone that works in the courthouse do if she now has breathing problems and an autoimmune disease? Is the county liable for the medical expenses? And piggybacking onto that one, who is responsible for the medical bills due to the mold?
That was beyond my scope.
Yep. So,
Well, I can answer that. So is the county liable for medical bills? I guess there's a couple different aspects to that. What seems to be what should happen is that the county would get together some amount of money to allow people to go to their physician or find a different physician who could test them for exposure to mold and determine, if they have some issues with the mold. And so that's in an ideal world, that's what the county would do, is they would allow employees to go get tested or make sure that it's covered by insurance. What the county will do, I don't know. So if someone has been affected by mold in some significant way, there's always a way to hold the county liable for that, for your injuries. That's another potential avenue to get medical expenses and other things paid for. If you're an employee, that's a workers' compensation claim. If you're not an employee, if you're somebody who goes to the courthouse on a regular basis, you're an attorney or whatever, then that's a civil lawsuit. But so, what is the county doing about it? Or, we don't know. I don't know. It should be paid for by insurance, but maybe some insurance coverages will not cover it in that situation. I would certainly ask for the county to cover any medical expenses. I don't see any downside to that, and I would suspect that they should.
Okay,
okay. Here's a question. Should those boxes be cleaned up when people are in the building? If not, how long should people be out of the building when the cleanup is done? There's a couple of people who've talked about these boxes. I'm assuming they are the ones in the sub basement. I'm looking to see if I can find the other question here. So just give me a moment there. Should our maintenance department be cleaning up these boxes with no remediation plan, or how safe is it to do this? Does this cause additional health problems for those of us having and experiencing health problems?
I believe that's one I should cover. And the deal is, when even in clients we work with, where they've done, say, a rehab in a kitchen or a bathroom, or where there's a plumbing fixture or mold, and they have contractors come in and do a rehab and remodel, they typically don't properly contain the work area to separate the air from the rest of the house. And they don't put controls on the air in the workplace to keep that air in the workplace isolated from the living space. And when that happens, when that doesn't happen, all of these live and dead mold chemicals go out into the house and played out. Very often we don't find a water source in the home or any past water damage to deal with, but what made the home wrong and not habitable was the result of the rehab work. And all those disturbances where all this old water damage stuff got into the air throughout the home. Same principle. So in any work area where you do cleaning of boxes or moving of content that has mold on it, or even cleaning and wiping mold off, a lot of this bad stuff goes into the air that gets distributed in the whole work area, and maybe even to other parts of the building. So if it's not done according to the way it should be done, it will make the level of the air you breathe worse than it was before doing that.
And I'll just give a visual on that. I used to tell patients, when you move stuff, that when you're not in containment, it's like a child blowing a dandelion. And it's gone even further than that. The latest data is more that microbial growth moves like smoke. So if you're just frivolously moving something with such obvious three-dimensional microbial growth, you're not only going to stir and spew right there, but it's going to go right into the ventilation system and get dispersed, as Larry was saying, into places far from the work area you were moving those boxes. And so it's better to let sleeping babies lie until containment's set up.
Okay.
Next question. How long I'm assuming they mean health effects. how long do the effects stay with you, or are they long-term?
It's a good doctor question. Dr. Heyman, do you want to try to address that?
I think he's muted.
Oh, I don't, and Charlie stepped away. I think he should be able to unmute himself. Dr. Heyman, if you hear this.
It doesn't allow us to unmute ourselves, Michelle.
Oh,
All right,
Carly's.
we'll try to get that corrected as soon as
Come back to
possible.
Carly just stepped away. Can you see how to?
Dr. McMahon, would you like to try to address that? You want the question?
Yeah, I think there can be long and there can be short-term effects. So for instance, if the problem is asthma, and every time you go into the building, you may potentially be triggered to have an asthma attack. And when you leave or you leave for the weekend, you're less likely to have an asthma attack because you're not being exposed. But for something more like hypersensitivity pneumonitis, which is another mold-based illness, or chronic inflammatory response syndrome, every time you go into the building and you breathe the air, you are potentially making the illness worse, and they're both chronic. And with additional exposures, you just have the potential to get sicker and sicker and sicker.
Very important information. Very good. Michelle?
Yes. So another employee asks, does Dave Bellis and the committee want to perform remediation over a period of several years without closing the courthouse? Is this safe or even feasible?
Even with containments that would be put up in work areas, they're not perfect, just like you can never create a perfect vacuum anywhere. And during the course of remediation, even with containments and even with controls, it's not perfect. There's a substantial risk that the air quality will be worse during the remediation than not doing the remediation. We find even in homes where remediation is done, in many cases, we recommend the occupants of the home be out of the home during the remediation. It works much better that way.
Okay. Our next question is, how does the Quincy Courthouse compare to other buildings you've tested for mold?
Well, to be honest with you, we do a handful of commercial buildings. Most of them are significantly smaller than this, but I would say whether it's commercial buildings, schools we've done, or even residential, these levels, I mean, many owners of commercial buildings have a zero Stachybotrys policy. Back when the old black mold thing started about 15 years ago, and there were bleed out in lungs of children in Cleveland and Atlanta in homes where there were high levels of Stachybotrys, even though diet was an issue with that, you know, there was a high correlation of Stachybotrys causing really ultra serious health effects. So this building has a preponderance of Stachybotrys in it. Now, not all of it is free water. We've seen with a lot of rust on some of the metal on all floors of the building that this building has had a high level of humidity over a long period of time. And it's the higher humidity and condensation on building materials and cellulose that's going to create the Stachy. So just the high presence of Stachy says this building has had high moisture. With high moisture, you're going to have growth of not only the other species of mold, but many other microbial vectors that can grow other than mold that can affect these patients as well. Repeat the question if you would, Michelle, please.
Oh gosh, I've moved on. Sorry. How does Quincy Courthouse compared to other buildings that you've tested for mold?
I'd say if we put it on a rating scale of how bad is it, I'd say it's in the top 10% of the highest level of bad, in that group of the highest level of badness.
Okay. Two questions regarding, Larry, you're going to want to expound on this as it relates to the surveys that were provided to us. One person asks, is the number of employees specific to this building accurate? And then the second one says, are the number of employees correct per department? The numbers looked way off.
Yeah, they do, you know, at a glance, But the way the surveys were created, we did not have them fill out that they worked in that area. We said, what areas of the building do you feel these effects? So many of them, even in their written comments, say, I feel these worse when I visit that area. It doesn't mean they're an employee in that area. So it's going to look like an inconsistency that like say 19 show up in that area that show a health effect, and only 10 of them are employees in that area. It is resolved because the respondents are not necessarily the number of employees in that area. Was there another aspect to that question?
No, those were the two. I mean, all we can answer is what was provided to us, right? It was what was shared with us, as far as, we don't know the numbers of employees that work in each
We don't
department.
even know the total number of employees. We only know, we got back 113.
So the next question is, it says, in your professional opinions, Larry and physicians, are you recommending the courthouse be closed immediately? Additionally, how does our courthouse compare to the Springfield, Massachusetts courthouse, where numerous individuals died?
I cannot address that. I have no data or information on that courthouse or what type of contaminants were present. And I think the doctors could opine on the type of illnesses they deal with, what percent of if any, may be cancer causing. I mean, there's a lot of variables involved in that. It's very hard to answer that, but there's no way, we can answer that
So maybe
question.